Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don's sitting in the driver's chair today for the Wayback Machine. By the way, we are going to create at least some type of t-shirt inside of our Inspired By store for the Wayback Machine. I just don't know what it's going to look like yet, but I got some ideas that we're putting together there. So for those of you that have either been to our online store, please do that. Just to check out what's already there, but also look for, we keep referencing the Wayback Machine, or the alternate history machine that Alexis and I used so often in early episodes. We're going to have a graphic of that eventually. Just stay tuned for that. But that is not the purpose of today's episode. The purpose of today's episode is for me to be joined by Robert Koshy. Robert, how you doing this evening?
Good.
And also by Chris Coppola, who probably should say hello to the good people.
Hello to the good people.
There we go. Now it's a Fork in Time episode. And we're going to do something. I don't know where to classify this one, guys. This is not a topic that we've had long standing in the queue. So sometimes we've been thinking about some of these things for a while. This one this one cut in line, so to speak. By the way, I think cutting in line is a very Southern aphorism that I've heard skipping being used to describe it by other people. There's a whole thing about just the language of how you cheat the queue. That we use different terms throughout that. But this one sort of cut ahead of others in line. And I think it's going to cross the line between what we sometimes call a whimsy episode to a degree. If for no other reason, just the story that we're going to use to launch off with the fork here. But then it's also one of those things that has maybe deeper legs than you think about that. As we were talking off podcast, sort of getting ready here, there's more implication to this than what you might imagine. And I'll explain my thoughts on this as we go through and some of the others that the team has brought up. But what we're going to do today is imagine a scenario where you see a locomotive. And the locomotive that's going down the track, and even modern locomotives today have something to this effect. They normally have something on the front of the engine, the front of the train, which is designed to make sure that if there is debris on the track, or if there's an animal or something else that gets on the track, it's diverted away from being pulled up underneath the actual train, the engine itself, and underneath the train. And the term that's normally used to describe this, if you think about the classic image of a locomotive, is this sort of pointed thing on the lower front that's got a downward plane and a point on the end. And the term that's often used to describe it is cow catcher. And so in front of the train on the engine, there is this construction that's at the front, if you will, the front prow of the train, that's designed to sweep anything that it might encounter on the track off of the track. And obviously with the name, with cow catcher, the thinking there is that might be livestock, but it could be anything that's there, debris, whatever the case might be. So apparently, as I've come to discover here, one Thomas Alva Edison, yes, the Thomas Alva Edison of inventor fame, the Wizard of Menlo Park. When in doubt, when there was a question about invention in history in school, you probably guessed Edison if you didn't know better, because at least you felt like you had a fighting chance by guessing Edison about whatever that invention might be. That this one, Thomas Alva Edison, that we know so well from American history and sort of American practical science application, was apparently quite the train aficionado, and thus would befriend engineers when he had the opportunity to travel on train. We're still in that era of train travel in the late 19th century being the norm. And he apparently more than once convinced the engineers of the train that the place he would like to ride is not in a passenger car. Maybe not even in the actual, engine itself with the engineer, but he wanted a little cushion, and he liked to sit out on the cow catcher, if you will, the prow of the train as it flew along at the closest thing to speed that they knew at that time, pre-automobile, pre-airplane. This was about as close as you were going to get to your Leonardo DiCaprio moment from Titanic and be quote unquote king of the world, if that makes any sense. And that all sounds well and good until something happens. And supposedly, at least on one of these little excursions in his early 30s, Edison later relates the story of having done this frequently to someone who's writing about him, and says that, yes, there was a close call once when the train hit a small animal of some type, which whizzed by his head and theoretically could have hit him or knocked him off of the front of the train moving at the speed that it was. Edison wasn't sure what it was, but the theory is that it's a badger. And so today we're going to look at the historical what if that could have been if Thomas Alva Edison had lost his life sitting on the cowcatcher of a train thanks to a flying badger. Chris, beside the first episode that you and I ever did together, where we had one Annie Oakley shooting the leader of a European nation on the rise, shooting the Kaiser, this may be the bizarrest start that we've ever had as our point of departure in a fork in time history.
We haven't done a cherries and cream episode. At some point, we might want to. So let's keep that open for ourselves.
Okay, so there's a tease for an episode to come someday. If you know what that is, you'll be excited. If you don't, that's a reason to tune in, right? So our point of departure here is an Edison in his 30s. So this is before a number of the most notable inventions that we credit him with come to be established in his name. We're going to spend a little bit of time, I know, talking about that. So this is before all of that. So we're going to have a world where there's no Edison to invent. Among other things, probably the number one thing he's credited with is the light bulb. There's no Edison to invent the phonograph. There's no Edison to be involved in the early mechanisms that will become motion pictures, as we know. This is all before that. So our point of departure is there's no Edison around to do all those things that we credit him with today. So stick with us. I think this is going to be a fun one, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But let's talk about the what did. So just quickly, guys, when we say Edison, what pops into your head? What do we think most of our listeners probably know about him or believe they know about him? What is Edison's claim to fame, Robert?
He invented practically anything and everything electrical, so much so that the original name of General Electric was Edison Electric Company, which is actually one of the 30 stocks that began the Dow Industrial that has stayed on the Dow Industrial all those years. Yep. So, there's a throw out, not to mention he invented, like you said, Don, the light bulb, the phonograph, many others. One of the big things he did that not a lot of people think about, and I think this is one area I want to explore a little bit as we think through the fork. He invented what we think of as your corporate research and development divisions as far as how it worked. The reality of it is, when most people hear Edison, they think of this guy in a laboratory working late hours at night by himself with candlelight before he has electric light, or gas light, and he's doing this all by himself. And that is nowhere near the part how Edison invented really anything. Edison had at one point thousands of people working for him in a sprawling complex. And they're doing a lot of the inventing and working and doing things and bringing it to him and saying, what do you think? Now, every now and then, he may be walking by the floor and say, hey, try that. But the reality of it is, most of his inventions are, A, like you mentioned before, Don, there's other people working on them at the same time. But B, it's all his assistants doing everything. And he had employment contracts written to the point that in reality, anything they invented, he owned the patent for, and his company owned the intellectual property. So in essence, he sets up not only how research and divisions are founded, research and development divisions at companies get founded, but he sets up how intellectual property law works, in that I write training for a living. I cannot take any training I write, because I've not ever been an independent contractor. I've always worked for a company. I can't take my training and take it other places that I've developed, because intellectually the company owns that training.
And so your work product, which comes out of your intellect, is the property of someone else as a result of you entered into that voluntarily. It's the result of a contract that you signed, but you no longer own the rights to your own intellectual output in that certain context.
Correct.
Yeah. And I know from a lot of the work that I've done in the business jobs that I've had and the roles that I've had, a common thing that we would look at in contract review is along that same thing. When we go to work as a contractor for someone else or that type of thing, IP rights, how intellectual property is protected is important. And then, how confidential information around intellectual property is important. Then also if something is innovated, for example, you innovate for that individual client, or that client brings an innovation to you, who owns that idea? So to your point, Robert, we're still living with Edison's coattails 150 years after he began active work as an inventor because of what he set up there. And
I'd even say
Chris?
he shouldn't be. I don't know if we should think of him as an inventor. He's a businessman.
Yeah.
He, as we said, there's other people working on this stuff. Some things, there are other people that beat him to certain things, but he's the promoter. He's the litigious person. He's the one that enforces those intellectual properties in a business mindset, more than just the pure tinkerer, the tinkerer of Menlo Park, or whatever of Menlo Park.
Wizard of Menlo Park.
Yes.
Yeah, which I think is an excellent point, and I bring that up because it even suggests more like he was. I'm not saying he was an intelligent guy. I'm not saying he wasn't a creative guy. I'm not saying that he didn't have, an entrepreneurial / inventor spirit too. I don't want to discredit him. There's a reason Edison is Edison, but I think Robert sort of painted the picture of, you got this picture of one guy sort of in this massive garage at Menlo Park, and he's doing all the output. You got the wrong picture about what was going on, particularly in the later years at Menlo Park, when a lot of these things are being churned out by the Edison Menlo Park machine, so to speak, the invention machine, the laboratory that he's set up is not just one guy in a lab, doing stuff. And, so some of the people that worked for him are names that you would recognize. We talked about this pre-podcast a little bit, but, there's people who worked for Edison include guys like, Nikola Tesla is the one that immediately comes to mind for me, because so much of what's associated with Edison is around electricity. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm just looking through the list here. Henry Ford worked for Edison. Others here on the list that's in front of me now. Some of them I recognize, some of them are probably more well-known in other areas. There's chemists here. There's obviously folks that worked around other parts of science, like, around the light bulb and around electricity. But, literally on the Wikipedia page here, there's a list of about 25 people of note that worked for Edison, and that's not even an exhaustive list. And there's 10,093 patents that were issued to Edison. And so I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that. What else should we hit on the Edison that was before we talk about the Edison that wasn't, guys?
Well, at the end of his life, him and Ford and Firestone became good friends and went auto camping together every year, which I find that incredibly intriguing.
Yeah. With Ford having been one of his guys bringing the popularity, at least, of the automobile into play in order to be able to do that. So I'm going to suggest, if you guys disagree with this, I want to get this sort of our agreement, disagreement with this out of the way on the front end. I generally believe that without Edison, in the big picture, almost everything we have technology that's credited to Edison still comes into being. It's this idea of there in most of these things, like a lot of invention, there's multiple people working on it at the same time. Sometimes somebody just wins the race, and sometimes by a little bit, or sometimes they just win the race to the patent office, even if they didn't win the race to actually producing it in the lab. And so I would argue, but if you guys disagree or we want to have a conversation about that, I'd like to do it here on the front end. I think that there's nothing that we credit to Edison that doesn't come into existence. It's not like we would be doing this podcast somehow today by gaslight and, I don't know, transcribing it onto vellum and then circulating it around the country or something, because technology just doesn't exist without Edison. I believe that anything of note, including the light bulb effect, there's a lot of things talked about, the other people that had light bulbs, or the concept there that was going on at the same time, that removing Edison does not change the scientific invention part. Can we agree upon that? Is there any point of disagreement you guys would like to raise on that, just to sort of get that out of the way before we start talking, I think, about the bigger impacts?
I can't think of anything that wouldn't have existed if he hadn't have been working on it. If he had not been around, I think we'd have ended up pretty much with the same things. Chris?
The only thing I'm going to put a fine point on is this: timing and sequence. Harkening back to another episode we did, this might have been my second episode, on a delay in research on the Manhattan Project. For certain things, the timing matters. So we're 120, 130, 140 years out from some of this research. Yes, everything has happened by now, but things may not have. Other exogenous factors may be happening without his technology. You understand that?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. But would we not have anything major that we have today? I think the answer is no. But would there potentially be an impact on history, even because of timing or because of even sequencing? It's not just when it happened, but in what order certain things happen. Because when you're talking about innovation, I think it's a really important point, Chris, and it's tough to it'd be tough to deconstruct these unless we spend an entire series of episodes, hundreds of them probably you could do this with, about because this innovation comes along, another innovation which was equally valid before they both come along gets stymied because it's viewed as being the inferior to what actually came forward. And so as a result of that, all of this innovation can happen, but the sequencing and the timing on it can change how it plays out over history. And the who does it and where they do it does make a difference, I think, in the macro historical sense. For example, if I say Motown, you're thinking Detroit. It's not called Motown because of the fact that it's Detroit, because it's the automobile industry. It's Motown because of motor companies. Well, if it's somebody other than Ford or somebody else who comes along because of the sequence here, maybe we're calling. I don't even know where it would be because I don't know who else. Somebody else.
You talked about the friendship between Ford and Firestone. We could be talking about Akron, Ohio, as Motown.
Right, exactly.
Because that was a huge tire. Right.
Yeah. And so, again, I think we get the same things, to your point, Chris, maybe not in the same order, and maybe the timing does matter because it has impact on other events in the timing that it does. But those are tougher to theorize in a fork, I think, in terms of understanding how they would interplay. And I think, generally speaking, my broad take on this, not to take away from what Chris just says, I think it's an important point what Robert said as well. I think this is one of those, when you exit off, when you take the fork, you end up back on the same road. Eventually, it's just you took a different route to get there.
One invention, let's just speak of, as I was sitting there thinking through things. Do we ever execute people by electricity?
Well, that's a good example, but I think that's a place maybe to jump off into what I think is the larger impact of not having Edison, if we've agreed with what I talked about with Chris's important asterisk or caveat to understand how that can play through. But what you just raised there, Robert, is not Edison the inventor. What you raised there is Edison the business guy.
Oh, yeah.
And Edison the business guy, that's a whole other animal. It amazes me when I've seen documentaries about Edison, or when I've read stuff like I was doing today when we were talking about this topic. What's the best word? Aggressive is probably the kindest word that I can think of to describe Edison as a business guy. He was, you might even say, dirty in other contexts.
He would have made Gordon
assertive. There you go, Chris.
He would have made Gordon Gekko look like a upright, standing member of the community.
Yes. So let's go down Robert's thing here. So Edison, one of the things that Edison is known for in the real timeline is the invention of the light bulb, right? Well, there's a fundamental problem with having a light bulb. What is the fundamental problem with having a light bulb versus the other modes of lighting, guys?
It requires this thing called electricity.
Yeah, which you might derive from a battery, depending on how you might generate that, a chemical battery, which, Edison has some patents when it comes to batteries as well. But ultimately, what you quickly realize you need is some distributed way of producing and getting electricity to these things. And by the way, the lighting that was being replaced, you mentioned this earlier, sort of gaslight, lamplight, had distribution systems because you were simply moving the natural gas or the other fuels that were doing that through there. So the realization was you needed to have some electricity distribution mechanism to make this light bulb something that's going to really, the light bulb is great. It's not what it is today. GE is not what it is today if you have no way of getting power to that bulb. So, Robert, I'll let you to discuss a little bit. What was Edison an advocate for in what's been called the War of the Currents?
So Edison wanted direct current, and direct current and alternating current. And it has been years since I studied this in physics. I will freely admit that operate similarly but differently. And so he was a idea of direct current, and the biggest difference was, so if you had direct current, let's see. Right now, Don and I, we're what, 30, 45 miles away from each other, Don, roughly?
Probably. Robert's much further. I mean, Chris is much further.
Yeah, Chris is much further. But Don and I, there is a pretty decent chance that Don and I are both obtaining our power through an alternating current method, delivery method, from the same power source.
Or generate, we could be sharing the same generation point.
Yes.
Potentially based on how the grid is functioning at this moment in time. It's
right.
possible.
It's a geographic fact. I'm pretty sure I'm not on the same one you guys.
Well, it's not more than a geographic fact, but that is a true statement. but yeah.
Because mine works in 20-degree weather.
Well, there you go.
Well, there's that. But yeah, we could be sharing the same. If you had a direct current system, basically my little small neighborhood of roughly 1,000 homes would probably have about 10 generators in
it. As I understand it, the first kind of scale implementation of this had a generator for a 3 or 4 block area.
Yeah.
And the limitation on direct current is how far, because it's how far the current travels in one direction. Distance is a factor in
because
what's being distributed and where it can get to and in what degree, right?
It's a current loss thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Imagine you're shooting like water through a hose. If the hose has holes in it, by the time it gets 30, 40 miles, like you were saying, there's no pressure behind it.
Right. So Edison is an advocate for this, a huge advocate for this.
He thinks it's safer.
And it can be argued that it might be, in the sense that, I've touched a 9-volt battery to my tongue and, gotten a little jolt out of that. That's a direct, granted it's small, but that's direct current that's doing that. I actually had to do a wiring repair at my house yesterday. I flipped the breaker off because I didn't want to mess with the 110 that was flowing to the light that I was having to make sure a wire was properly tightened on. So the other alternative thing was this thing called alternating current, which, by the way, one of Edison's proteges, Tesla, was a big advocate for. And Tesla leaves. Tesla ends up hooking up with this guy named, you've heard of him, Westinghouse. And so they are an advocate for during this War of the Currents, which is an incredibly interesting story. I've seen a number of documentaries. I remember a PBS documentary in particular here. And alternating current uses a different mode of transmitting the current, and the current flows in multiple directions, and thus is capable of being transmitted over a much farther distance without what Chris described as the hole in the water hose problem about what you lose. It's not a 100% solution in terms of how far and how much power you can send, but is much more capable of sending larger amounts of power over a greater distance, distributing to a larger network. So these two guys, Edison and his direct current advocates, and Westinghouse and the alternating current, are competing during the War of the Currents over because eventually one standard has to be decided here too. That's the other thing, right? That's the other, I think, interesting side note of this whole discussion. And so in doing that,
this was VHS and beta before VHS and beta.
Yeah, although more of a difference probably between the quality of the two things that were going on.
Or more a Blu-ray and an HD DVD.
Yes. Okay.
I'll buy that. And so, to your point, you said there at least might be one elephant that would still be alive, right, Robert? Because
Chris threw that out, but yes.
Yeah. So Chris, tell that story, because you're the one that actually named the elephant, because I didn't know the elephant.
So this is another, I guess, hat that we could assign to Edison, and it does kind of go hand in hand oftentimes when we think about businessmen. There was an elephant at the Brooklyn Zoo that had gotten loose a couple of times, and was walking around the city causing havoc. And Edison decided to basically make a show of electrocuting Topsy the elephant. And there is actually video footage from one of his inventions of another of his inventions, electrocuting an elephant. And he did this, and he also, the other story being, he built, and I think Robert is the one that touched on this, electrocution. He built electric execution devices, but he built them using alternating current.
Not his mode of transmission. What he was actually trying to do was say, this other mode is less safe than mine. Let me show you. We're gonna deal with this elephant, and then, as I understand the story and what I read today reinforces this, he convinced, I guess it was the New York legislature, and they brought we're looking for a more humane quote unquote humane means of capital punishment. That's a whole other discussion we could have for a whole other day. But he convinces them to actually adopt the electric chair, electrocution as the mode of doing that. And again, the electricity is being delivered by alternating current, which is his competitor's current. Edison was not in the business here of trying to sell electric chairs, or else he would have had them powered by his own DC, because that would have been the business model to follow if that's what you were about. He was actually using them as a demonstration of why his technology was safer than his competition's.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because what he actually did is his electric company went and bought some Westinghouse AC dynamos that were being retired to hook up to the electric chair that he built for the demo, so that Westinghouse's items would be, this is that assertiveness that we talked about, so that he could push it. Electrical execution has performed by Westinghouse Dynamo.
Yeah.
Kind of setup.
I was actually in my head trying to run through like what a modern equivalent of that would be, where you use the potential deadly aspects of your competitor's product as a way to promote your own product indirectly by showing what's unsafe about theirs. And I came across a couple of them, but I don't know if I came up with any good ones when I was doing that to my head. But Chris is nodding. Maybe he's got one.
Yeah, I feel like a good example of something in our world would be something we've touched a little bit on currently, is the battle of the mobile operating systems, and bringing an I can just picture the turtleneck bringing an Android device up on stage and crashing it to show how unreliable the other people's technology, or hacking it, or things like that, because that is a somewhat similar duopoly, that there's two incompatible technologies. I will even concede that on a technological basis, there is less difference between the two mobile operating systems than, like we were saying, we're not going to have coal power plants, oil power plants on every block.
Yeah, I think the one that jumps into my head there along the same lines, Chris, I think you're in the vein that I thought of, was, imagine, this is back before things got more sophisticated and the Apple computer environment became much more of a target for computer viruses. There was a period of time when PCs were the unsafe, exposed to the computer virus world, and there was something magical about the Mac and the Apple operating system. Now that had to do surely with the fact of, if you're going to write computer viruses, you write them to do the most damage possible, so you write to the largest market penetration, among other things. But also closed systems versus open systems too is the other part of the equation.
Or target people that have real jobs.
Well, there you go. Yeah, see,
You knew something was coming. You
Yes.
knew one of those was coming.
see at least one previous episode of The Room where it happened. I think it's called Three Old Men and Brody, where we talk a little bit about this. We talk about the Apple garage, sort of being the place that things were done. But and again, we may have gotten a little bit of a field here, except to say if there's no Edison to do that, and by the way, that was not successful. In the end, alternating current became what the system is built upon, primarily because it was the technology that was going to solve the problem better than direct current was in the technology that existed at the time. And then they win the Westinghouse wins a World Fair, showing off the power of this in the late 19th century. And then the first power station that goes in at Niagara Falls, alternating current enables them to actually power Buffalo, which is 35 miles away. They're able to transmit the power to that distance and make it work.
And that World's Fair actually is one of the things I was thinking about when I was making the point about sequences of discoveries. That World's Fair may not have been able to be powered. It may have been the St. Louis Fair later on, or it may not have even been in the United States, but something like that.
Right. And so to Robert's point in bringing this up, if we take Edison out of the equation, thank you, Mr. Badger, in Edison's early 30s. If we take Edison out of the equation, first of all, this has become a recurrent theme for me. He's not joining us tonight for the recording, but I'm thinking about Eric Rush. He mentioned before in episode one human up, we're one elephant up at a minimum under this scenario. We're one badger down, but we're probably at least one elephant up for a period of time if there's no Edison. But, to your point, Chris, first of all, is there even a war of the currents in the sense that we see? Could it have been somebody else who would have been coming with a different technology, purporting something else? And could we have a very different way that at least the early electric grid came to be in the United States?
Or would AC and its advantages have gotten big first, and DC is just not even an issue? And then here's another thing to throw out there. If we don't have the battle of the currents, what does Australia's most famous rock and roll band name itself?
All I can say about that, Chris, is I sit here thunderstruck by the thought. That's all I can say about that. So I want to explore a little bit more, because I think, Robert, you brought up in our discussion pre-recording, to me, the most fascinating part of this. I think in the end, AC would have won out just because it was the more logical technology. Who would have done it, or how it would have done.
It would have went faster.
Yeah.
I think it was slowed down by Edison because
I think that's Edison. A fair place to go. Yeah. I mean, Edison had sway, right? So if Edison is the one who's not just electrocuting elephants, but and building electric chairs, if he's not standing against it, it probably is a more logical thing. Oh, this is the perfectly logical way to do this. I'm more intrigued by the thing that Robert brought up. That's the place I'd like for us to spend a little bit more time. This idea of how R&D structures were put into place by Edison. And then there's one other sort of sidelight to this I know that we'll get over to, because it's the other thing I think that's the more notable thing that we may feel the difference of today that would be without Edison. So Robert, do you think, we didn't talk about this off podcast, do you think it's inevitable that something like Edison's model would have come into being? Or is that really a force of Edison's business acumen that causes that to be?
Potentially. I haven't thought about if Westinghouse had done anything like this. And if he did he base it on what he saw from Edison? I think R&D itself would have developed out, because somebody would have figured out, hey, let's put a bunch of minds together in one place to come up with a problem and solve it. And it makes much more sense. I'm not so sure intellectual property follows the same pattern, because I'm not sure everybody gets as ruthless as he is with patents.
I think it does. And
okay.
I'm thinking specifically about a lot of what happens around this time with Supreme Court jurisprudence, where it may have become a quote nowadays, but corporations are people too. And that was definitely something that was very much a point made by the legal people making these decisions around then. And if it's not in the electrical field, it's Firestone in vulcanization, or it's somebody else in, because it kind of feels like Edison is looked at as an earlier version of an inventor, the tinkerer in his garage, while at the point they're at, this is kind of a tipping point where you need the research model that you talked about of modern R&D. You need the amount of capital behind it. You need economic capital. You need the human capital of getting these people together and having significant research facilities, because some genius in their barn can't keep up anymore.
Well, yeah, and it goes back to one of the, I think it was second or third Room Where It Happened podcast that we did, kind of plug our other show a little bit, where we talk about the garage and you know,
and how that, how ultimately there you had, whether it was Hewlett and Packard, or whether it's it's a couple of guys named Steve, or whether it's a Bill Gates or whatever it might be, sort of that Silicon Valley sort of way of doing things. To your point, Chris, the ideas are great, but somebody's got to take that idea and turn it into something that becomes viable in terms of being grown and sold.
And it's interesting to think about that mythology and how important that has become to us, because I don't know about your garages. No garage I've ever been in would work as a clean room to actually manufacture microchips. Those were manufactured somewhere, and they, Jobs and Wozniak did their thing with them, put them together in a unique combination, but the technology to produce their inputs is not something you can do at their level.
There's a whole series of topics. I think it's a whole podcast that somebody ought to jump on. We have two already, so it's not going to be me. But in my mind, I call these the American mythologies. We have so many of these things that we sort of hold to as if they're true. They're mythology in the sense they're maybe based in some truth, but they become legend very quickly. Like you said, they're not building computers in the garage there. Even the homebrew computer market that they were, dealing with there, those chips were not being made there. Yeah, you were putting things together there. You were taking components and combining them. You're writing some code, maybe you're building some operating systems, that kind of thing. But you're right. No garage I've ever seen qualifies as a clean room to do the types of things that you need to do there. Or, another example of this is, Robert hit it on the head. I think when we learn about Edison in school, we think about, this guy that's out there in his barn who's, having eureka moments left and right. And that's not really true. I mean, in the long run, it's not true. Maybe there's instances of that early on, but that's not what it becomes, while most of the things we're talking about here that he's credited with are being cranked out.
I would argue the very last true invented in my garage type deal maybe was the Apple computer. I don't know if you've had one since then, unless you want to consider Facebook, but that's a whole nother conversation.
But I actually think almost that personal computers and what you were saying about the new importance of intellectual property as opposed to a physical economy thing actually makes Invented in My Garage easier, because you can do professional level cutting edge stuff from your garage in the intellectual property mindset of, you can make an app from your garage, you can make an app from anywhere. So and if that's
right, you do that.
Yeah, but and so it becomes, really it's not even so much the garage, it's the dorm room, or it's or it's Bezos. I guess there's a little bit of a garage mythos around Amazon to a degree, but really, the same type of thing that's there. But again, this idea of what we credit Edison with, which I think was your argument, was, Chris, this was going to happen because the economic forces of the day, what was needed in terms of financial capital, what was needed in terms of human capital, necessitated that you weren't going to quote unquote mom and pop this stuff in the late 19th century and have it go anywhere, right?
Right. And there's one more thing legal framework of intellectual property rights, that was going to be very important as well.
Yeah. And, so that later becomes, trademarks and other things that companies do to protect, their interests. The thing that just popped into my head, which was really bizarre, there is even the idea of something totally, as far as I know, Edison never did anything in the pharmaceutical realm, but how the pharmaceutical industry works, those chemicals exist out in nature, but putting those chemicals together in that way, producing that thing, that's the IP, and that's what you're able to protect for a period of time before you can make that drug as a generic drug. It has its protected period as a protected pharmaceutical development, research and development produced that allow you your rights to a certain amount of profits in a way for a period of time you wouldn't have any other way.
There's one other kind of a I will admit I am unsure about how accurate this story is, but Robert was mentioning earlier that he's always been in the professional training world. He's developed trainings, and he cannot, since he's been on this podcast, he has changed jobs.
Mm-hmm.
He cannot use previous trainings at his new jobs.
There's one thing I took with me from my previous company to my new company, only because we never adopted it and never rolled it out and never branded
it. I think you guys have probably heard of the absurdity of the idea of Subway sandwich artist. Have you heard of this one?
This was I've heard the term, so
I know the term.
Robert, do you want to pick it up?
I don't. I just know the term. It's the guys that make the Subway sandwiches. They tried to claim themselves to be artists at one point.
Not the opposite. The Subway franchisee corporation claimed that the making of sandwiches, their way, is an intellectual property, and tried to apply non-competes to sandwich makers so they could not take the secret sauce of their sandwiches and apply them at Wendy's or Quiznos or any other place that comes to mind that serves things between pieces of bread.
Given that this has a New Jersey flair because of Edison, it seems to me that Jersey Mike's would be the place that we would need to go in the sandwich battle here. Yeah, and again, this may seem a little esoteric for us as a topic for the podcast here, but the thing that sort of resonated with me when I was thinking about this as a topic and suggested it is, we take what happened with Edison living and being there, and what happened there is that's just the way it was and the way that it was always going to be. And I think very often when we go through an episode here on A Fork in Time, the thing that Alexis and I discovered very early on was we would constantly run these things up. You would run the fork for a little ways, then you realized it comes back to the main road. It was more of a detour than a fork. And the first thing that came into my mind is if you lose Edison because of the idea of multiple developers, multiple inventions, simultaneous development, which we know there's tons of examples of this throughout history, not just with the things that Edison did. But, again, it's not like we're not going to get something that we have. Chris's very important point being made about sequence sometimes matters and timing can make a difference. So immediately I thought, nothing really changes. And it wasn't until we were pre-recording and talking about that Robert said, but what about this? This idea of the lab. And I think that could be different. Although, Chris, you make a compelling case for why that was probably also inevitable, just in a different form because of what was going on with legal challenges. And it's not like there weren't other economic institutions, see the railroads, see the oil companies at that time, who weren't doing similar things to protect every interest that they had in every possible way that they could.
I think Edison just ended up being the most ruthless about
and in the right place at the right time, and also maybe even I don't know enough about what's unique about state law here versus federal law, especially when it comes to patents and all that. But New Jersey was probably a pretty good place to do some of that stuff in terms of the legal framework that existed there. Probably gave some advantages to an Edison that another state might not have offered Edison. Which leads to the other thing that I think is an interesting point of departure. potentially if Edison gets, killed by a flying badger. Again, just the concept of that in my head. I can't get this image out of my head about what causes our fork here. Is the Academy Awards live from Hackensack, live from Menlo, New Jersey? Do we have, Chris, I know you know this story a little bit. You've alluded to it in other conversations we've had. Eric Bond, I guess, on one episode we talked a little bit about this as well. Why in the world is Hollywood Hollywood? Well, it has a little bit to do with one Thomas Alva Edison, right?
Right. And this might be another interesting difference, which is Edison, because he did stumble upon that R&D model, was able to concentrate a lot of discoveries. So if we think about, so let me take a pause and do the what did happen. Edison, quote, air quotes here, invented motion pictures, and he aggressively maintained his intellectual rights on motion picture cameras and the production of movies. And Hollywood developed, to some extent, the motion picture industry developed in Los Angeles because it is geographically as far away from New Jersey as you can get. We hadn't annexed Hawaii yet. And it was literally, they went to the West Coast to hide out from Edison's lawyers, where they could skirt some of these copyrights and develop their own thing outside of the watchful eye, I guess is the best way of putting it.
Out of sight, not front in mind, therefore not producing court case to try to enforce something that's going on.
Right. And this, one of the interesting things I'm thinking about now is, if it hadn't have been for Edison's earlier successes, he may not have the resources, or better yet, the person that does develop motion pictures may not have had these earlier successes and had the economic resources to have lawyers on retainer to actually enforce this. So
two things.
Yeah.
So one thing, one of the earliest motion pictures developed outside of like horses and gymnasts just to demonstrate the technology is actually a film that existed, the 1900 hurricane aftermath of that hit Galveston. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part of that is, as you're thinking through, Edison hated talking movies. He thought it ruined acting at the time.
And that's actually one of the things I was thinking about when I was talking about sequencing. It developed in Los Angeles when it did. If, for example, the sequencing is different, maybe it's in a Galveston or a Houston area because of cheap land, relatively, 360-ish filming days available. As another thought, why not even another city in California that suffers a natural disaster about this time?
1906 in San Francisco.
1906, right? Yeah.
Where how much of our mythology of Hollywood has to do with the gold rush, going to California to make it rich? San Francisco is where that happens. So again, if the motion picture industry is shifted around and is making its decision to get out of the New York area at a different point, maybe they pick a different source, or possibly if so much of these inventions and these patents aren't centralized, somebody is going to come up with motion pictures, but maybe they're not going to have patents on light bulbs, on electric transmission, on all of these other things, and have all of these resources to enforce their copyrights, or frankly to the way they enforce their copyrights are different. Maybe they're a little more open to licensing it to people that are willing to pay for it, and not drive the motion picture industry away.
Yeah. That was the other thing that popped into my head. You were going there. You got there a little bit ahead of me, Chris, in the sense of, there probably still is there's a business model that gets formed, but maybe it's a different business model that happens, a franchise model, or or again, the delay here. If it's not, if Edison doesn't have the laboratory that's doing these types of things, I know there was a lot of stuff going on the continent. There was a lot of stuff happening in France, for example, with this technology. Maybe it's the United States importing French technology to do these things versus, their homegrown versions of it that were competing against what was coming over from Europe at the time that, was a similar, similar ability to do things, just doing it in a different way. Yeah. Just, side note here, just to throw it out there because it popped up in the research. So you've probably heard this, Edison and Bell were both working on the thing that we sort of know to become the telephone. This is actually a case of where somebody other than Edison sort of, beat won the patent war here. But in Edison's version of phones, as we would know them now, you would not answer hello. Apparently he was an advocate for you would answer ahoy. So, that's another thing that, I guess in either case, this was Edison surviving, didn't matter, but we avoided answering our phone calls with ahoy. So there you go. There's something to be said for that.
There's something usually to be said for that.
I think so too. All right. Did we miss anything big here, guys? I mean, I know we may have gone a little shallow here and a little wide here. Did we miss anything that's just, that's out there that's probably worthy of mention?
There is one thing that I just find a unique irony, and I laugh at it. You've talked a little bit about, and we've talked a little bit about a modern entrepreneur who's very much in kind of this Edison mold of an Elon Musk. And what is the name of his car company?
It's Tesla.
Tesla.
And yet, what is the major electrical current? What is the research that he's doing on these cars? It's battery. It's DC technology.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, but the other big place that Musk's footprint is in solar and battery, and that's because of battery technology, by the way, the ability to take solar energy and actually store it in a meaningful way. And so it is that case of maybe Edison was right. He was just right 100 years early in terms of the technology, or because of AC being what it was in terms of centralizing generation as being the model that we have now. So the reason you have to have a grid is you have to have a place that you're transporting this centralized generation across.
This might be the ultimate story of what I was saying about sequence mattering, because while you can't have a 3-mile island on every block, you certainly could have solar panels on the top of every building to have a more decentralized and a more localized power generation capacity.
Yeah. And even one of the interesting things, we're about 2 weeks post the major landfalling hurricane of the 2022 season. That was Ian in Florida. And I actually saw a news story about a community that had been built there that was intentionally built around the concept of being better equipped to survive an event like this. Part of that was how it was designed to deal with storm surge issues and some of the other things that are. This is one of those areas, because of my past work life, I know a little bit more about than others do. But where this ties back to our discussion here was that was a small localized power distribution grid, so that they were not as dependent upon the major things that could happen to the grid as a whole as a result of this event. Thus, they were more sustainable and resilient during an event, because it was much more like, Robert was talking about there, what would you have in your local neighborhood there of, 1,000 homes? Well, you would have 3 or 4, but once you got that up and going, and the distance of what you would have to hook back up is far less complex than the large grids that we have today that are often dependent upon each other in different ways to make that happen. So I think that's an interesting point, Chris, and the idea, the irony again of, Nikola Tesla is just one of the most fascinating figures of the last 200 years of history to me, because there's so much there that we sort of know, or that we sort of wonder about, that we sort of think he's more as much legend as he is reality. Obviously, a bright guy, obviously somebody that Musk looks to, or else he would not have made that choice. But you're right. And by the way, Tesla was an advocate for AC apparently back in those days, and until he could transmit the power wirelessly, which apparently he was working on. We don't know how far he got with that, but he was working on that. It's sort of it's ironic. It is ironic that around the 125-ish years later, we've come back around full circle, and now the names have changed to be applied to something else.
I always just think it was probably, just knowing the two people, Edison and Tesla, it probably was just easier to get to name your company Tesla than, as Robert was saying, there were already companies named Edison. So
Yep.
I mean, you could probably just get the rights easier more than anything else.
And by the way, if you tried to name something Edison, you didn't get Thomas Alva's approval for it, you were going to get sued. So there you go.
Exactly. Tesla's just kind of out there doing his thing, and he's not like that rolling in his grave if you name your company after him.
Yeah, there you go. Good point. I as somebody who likes and appreciates irony, Chris, I always like it being pointed out, that there is irony there. And for those of you, I think we will have talking again about what I sort of led the episode off with and are inspired by it in our podcast store. There will ultimately be the Musk Bond villain, some type of apparel or logo stuff that's sold there, because I know that's how Chris thinks of Elon. Is he's like the cross between Edison and a Bond villain, right?
Yeah, I actually got into a discussion with people on a commuter train that, yes, probably a couple of months afterwards was horribly shut down because it hit a deer, but that's a different story. That maybe the idea of Bond villains was meant to condition you to think that these kind of eccentric geniuses coming in disrupting economic modalities are
Villains.
secretly evil. Yes.
Yeah, that they're villains. There's a concept there too. All right. Anything else that we missed, guys?
I think we pretty much covered, because like you said, I'm with you, Don. I don't think it's a fork as much as a detour.
Yeah, but you see different things along the way when you take the detour. That's that was I think the one of the ways that Alexis described it to me once is, yeah, but didn't you see different things along the way? And the answer is, yeah. You ended up in more or less the same place, but the journey was different along the way. So sometimes it's the same. It's the same, but it's different all at the same time, which is an interesting concept of what goes on here. Well, guys, I appreciate you spending some time tonight. I'm going to close out the show with a couple of reminders to our listeners. Within the next month, we'll be coming back around at least for probably the second and third episodes in our installment of the series that we started off with Bo Breslin. We're due to get the next couple of recordings done on that. So if our listeners are going, hey, I really enjoyed those, where's the rest of that? It's coming. We just have to coordinate the recording across the pond with Bo to make that happen effectively. So that's in the works there as well. If you haven't gone there, I'm just going to put out the plug for it again. We have our Discord server that's out there now. There'll be links in the show notes on how to get there. A place to interact with our listeners. I've started really enjoying, make at least a trip once a day over to the Discord server to see if somebody's posted, because we have our listeners posting feedback here on shows, topical suggestions. So if you want a way to interact, we know the podcasting is pretty much a one-way audio medium. That's the nature of what it is. But again, we've tried to build a community, and one of the ways the community can communicate directly with each other and not just with us is there at the Discord server. So if you haven't found us there, come and join us. I really enjoyed interacting with some of the listeners that I had interacted with by email there before. So I had the privilege of interacting with them, but not everybody had the privilege of interacting with them. And I think that's one of the advantages of that particular thing. I'm going to put out a very large output here. I want somebody from this community to come and take me on in the area of diplomacy online. You think you can manage the 7 powers? that are leading up to World War I better than they did, come on and prove it. There's a place to do that in the online diplomacy community that we built. There's details, again, linked in the show notes and on the website for some games that are just for our listeners and just for our team that want to play there. It's an interactive experience too, because that's a negotiation stuff that goes on there. We have to convince each other to do things, so it's another way to interact. So I just want to throw that out there. I've been playing a fair amount of diplomacy here of late, but I haven't been playing it with or against this community, and so I'm throwing down the gauntlet, guys. Come and take me on. If you've thought about doing that, now's the time, and come and do it. Check it out in the show notes. We did mention the podcast store where we have some logo stuff. If you'd like to have a fork where it happened, that'd be a whole different thing. A fork in time or room where it happened mug or a t-shirt or some of the things that are from our Inspired by series, a Bismarck face palming, is one of the things that you can get. That's Chris's Inspired by thing. Come and check us out. There's again links in the show notes for our site there at I guess that's the site there at T Public now is where we are now, where we're doing that. Some pretty cool stuff. Alexis got her room where it happened coffee tumbler in within the past week. I got a chance to see it. It's quality stuff. She loves it. And so if you want to check some of that stuff out, we really don't make money doing that. It does help support the show, but that's not what it's about. And by the way, the live stream discount code, which will get you 10% off of anything, is still active through the middle to end of this month. It has about 2 weeks left from the airing of this episode, so it's not too late to take advantage of that promo code. Other than that, we do invite you to the website. You can support us via Patreon, all the blah, 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 usable podcast stuff here. But again, most of all, we thank you for giving us the gift of your time and engaging with us here. So I'm going to go around really quick to see if Chris or Robert have any final comments before we throw it to a close. Robert, you have anything to share with the good listeners?
I don't. I think this was an interesting exercise to think through, where we end up without Edison.
Yeah. And again, the bizarre way that Edison dies here. That's what
first. Oh, that's Flying Badger is just amazing.
Yeah, that's what attracted me. I got to say honestly, that's what attracted me to this topic. First of all, is I don't care where we go with this episode, but to start it with Edison dies by Flying Badger, that's worth something just right then and there. Chris, what do you have for the good people, if anything?
The only thing it's literally going through my mind right now is a episode of The Big Bang Theory, where Sheldon is tracking his family history to try and figure out how long he's going to live. And there is actually a member of his extended family that he wrote KBB beside, killed by Badger. Yes, because he decided to go into a crawl space and fight a badger with a broom. Yeah.
Yeah, not a good call. Not a good call. So what the other thing we've learned here, badgers are dangerous. That's the other thing we've learned in this episode.
Can be dangerous. Can be. And again, from what you read, we're assuming it's a badger. It was a bear cub size thing. I have heard nothing that it's not a possum. Anything like that.
We can neither confirm nor deny
a raccoon.
It could have been a raccoon.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been
any number of varmints.
To borrow something that Eric Rush said when I think it was on our Eisenhower episode recently, sort of the public service announcement here is don't ride on the cow catcher of a train. That's sort of the public service announcement here. Is there's good reasons to be inside the moving vehicle versus I think the analogy that I used for this maybe off podcast was instead of pretending you're DiCaprio from Titanic on the front of the train, screaming at the top of your lungs that you're king of the world, which I don't think Edison was doing, but there's some parallels here.
That being said, if we think about sequencing, technically DiCaprio was doing an Edison on the front of the train.
So there you go. Well, and by the way, there's a whole, if I can find it, I will put it in the show notes. I've seen a YouTube video that it's a longer one that does like 30 minutes or so, if I remember correctly, on why Titanic is a time travel movie. I'm just saying that's out there.
Okay.
So again, I think we've stumbled down several interesting paths here along the detour, but good stuff. So Chris, Robert, thanks for joining. Thanks to our listeners for joining. Robert, I'm going to throw to Chris today. I threw to you, I think, last week when we were closing something out. So I'm going to throw to Chris today in Alexa's absence. We really like this idea of forks in time. And so if you happen upon a fork in time, Chris, do we have any suggestions for our listeners?
Take it.
Take it. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.